Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I can see some of you have doubts with respect to your application forms that have been released yesterday. I will take a separate session on this and I'll inform you about it by today itself. Okay. Now, Vibhas sir is not available in the morning today because he has to prepare for the budget session that he's doing an analysis on. So we've gotten this opportunity to have a longer class, and the agenda for today's class is uh, to cover your entire mains portion of the parliament and also separation of powers entirely. So let's spend some time and let's understand this to the right amount of detail as it may be necessary. Okay. Right. When we look at the exact syllabus, it says Parliament and state legislatures, structure, functioning, conduct of business, powers and privileges, and issues arising out of these. We had discussed some of the questions with respect to anti-defection law when we were studying anti-defection law. Let us spend some time and look at all of the kind of questions that have been asked so that we understand what is it that we should really be preparing in the context of the parliament. So 2013, as we know, there was a question on individual MPs and anti-defection law. 2014, for 200 marks, there was a question which said the powers, privileges and immunities of the parliament and its members as envisaged in Article 105 of the Constitution leave room for a large number of uncodified and unenumerated privileges to continue. As assess the reasons for the absence of legal codification of the parliamentary privileges. How can this problem be addressed? This question is a very clear one, which says, why were parliamentary privileges, in terms of whatever they mean, in terms of what constitutes a parliamentary privilege and what doesn't, why were they not inserted in the first place? And second, how can we solve them? Third, discuss the role of the Public Accounts Committee in establishing accountability of the government to the people. A direct question on evaluating what is the role that is being played by the Public Accounts Committee. Then in 2017, for 15 marks and 250 words, the Indian Constitution has provided for holding a joint session of the two houses of Parliament, enumerate the occasions when this would normally happen and also the occasions where it could not. Now, this also has a lot to do with the tenures and the sessions, and the golden rule is anything passed, pending or introduced only in the Lok Sabha ends with the previous Lok Sabha. Anything passed, pending or introduced in the previous Lok Sabha ends with the previous Lok Sabha. Now, in that context, when I've discussed the conditions of joint sittings with you, analyzing why this happens and what are the reasons behind it. Why do you think the committees are considered useful for parliamentary work? And discuss the role of the Parliamentary Estimates Committee. Again, the name of the committee changes and you're asked to do a full analysis on it. In 2019, The question on private members or individual parliamentarians is on a decline, which has adversely affected the quality of debates and their outcome. Why do you think that happens? And what can we do to essentially make it better? Then in 2022, then in 2020, the question was on the analysis of the speaker. Once a speaker, always a speaker. Do you think this practice should be adopted to impart objectivity to the office of the Speaker of Lok Sabha? What could it be? What could be its implications for the robust functioning of parliamentary business in India? Basically, asking you to look at the neutrality versus the apolitical nature that could be there for the office of the Speaker. And then 2020 was, I think, a slightly, tricky kind of a question. It was, the Rajya Sabha has been transformed from a useless Stephanie tire to the most useful supporting organ in the past few decades. Highlight the factors as well as the areas in which the transformation could be visible. This question is already giving you a direction on which you should give your opinion. That how has the Rajya Sabha become a supporting organ and a true merit of the second house, and where have we been able to see something like this? This does not mean that you can't take an alternate stand and say that, well, it has done good things, but it can also do some other better things. Now, in 2021, last year, there was a question on departmentally related standing committees as a direct question from parliamentary committees, right? You will find the printable versions of these in your drive as well, in the updated folders. We've already covered anti-defection law. Let us spend some time, and of course there's a question on state legislative councils. This was already there in the notes. So we were able to, which basically means that both the questions that were asked in the mains from here could be directly answered entirely from the notes that I had given you right before the mains exam this year also. And the same hopefully should also happen next year as well. Okay. Now, let's look at next kind of debates. First, the first point of analysis that we have is, I understand that in a parliamentary democracy, and in especially the Westminster form of parliamentary democracy, which is where the elected executive is nothing but a subset of the legislature, which we have borrowed from the UK. This is a situation where the ministers or the lower house will have a certain advantage when it comes to the kind of passing of bills. To put it simply, the BJP has majority in the Lok Sabha. And therefore, when the BJP has majority in the Lok Sabha, it is almost given that a bill will never ever face defeat in the Lok Sabha. It is almost given that any restrictive parliamentary motions such as adjournment, no confidence or censure will never really see fruition in the Lok Sabha. In fact, the discussions on the bill in the Lok Sabha or the amendments to the bill in the Lok Sabha are hardly a possibility, given the fact that the majority of the Lok Sabha belongs to the same political party on which the ministers have been chosen. Similarly, in a situation where most states in India, if have the same political party at the center as also the government in the states, if most states in India have BJP governments, then most legislative assemblies in India will have BJP majorities. If most assemblies in India have BJP majorities, then the Rajya Sabha MPs, which will be chosen by most states, will also have BJP majorities, which means there is an indirect way through which we can ensure that the larger chunk of MPs in the Rajya Sabha also belong to the same political party as the one which is in majority in the Lok Sabha. And when this happens, then the ministers and the party gets an advantage in both the houses. But we must also understand that a majority of the members of both the houses are not ministers. In fact, we understood that through the 91st Constitutional Amendment 2003, we were able to absolutely be certain that the number of ministers cannot exceed the total strength of the Lok Sabha by 15%, which means these number of ministers can come from either of the two houses, but their quantum is dependent on the strength of 15% of the Lok Sabha, which means everybody else is a non-minister. Some may be members of the ruling party, some may be members of the opposition party. But at the end of the day, they are equal members in terms of the functions of the parliament, which is deliberation, discussion, and legislation. All of the three core functions can equally be done, constitutionally speaking, through any member of the parliament. It doesn't matter what kind of member you are or how you became a member of the parliament. You have equal rights to propose a bill, to discuss an issue, to raise a grievance. But these equal functions over the years have become very distorted as the parliament mostly doesn't take up the initiatives of these private members. It also is a larger question mark or the sense of security that people would have. Theoretically speaking, if an opposition MP drafts an excellent bill and that bill is taken up on the floor of the House and the bill gets passed in the Lok Sabha, the larger message that goes to the rest of the country is that if the opposition MPs are drafting bills and it is their bills that are being passed even by the ruling party, then what is the ruling party doing? Why have they not really thought of this? And the opposition will leave no stone unturned in trying to score political brownie points out of this. Which is why there has been a larger discussion on private members or private members' works. I'll start this discussion by giving you some amount of context with respect to the recently conducted winter session from November to December 2021. What you can always do is right before the mains exam, which is in September for all of you, we would have had the monsoon session around that time. If not the monsoon session, we would have definitely finished up with the budget session, which has already started. So you can take up the most recent examples from the monsoon session of 2022 and replace these examples with the monsoon session of 2022. Okay, I'll anyways give you some replacements or some data updates which you can integrate in your answers. You will find them in the Google Drive as well. There will be a separate folder that will say data replacement and additions to the existing questions. Okay, very clearly with page numbers and the slide number and topic. So the winter session that happened between November 29th to the December 23rd, which is basically the month of December, there were 26 bills that were listed for introduction, consideration, and passing. One of these bills, which also saw a lot of limelight in the media, was a bill which was proposed by a BJP MP on whether the preamble can be amended or not. To which the Rajya Sabha withheld the bill and said, unless we are absolutely clear in the law that the preamble can be. Because while the preamble was amended in 1976 through the 42nd Amendment, it was only the Supreme Court later in subsequent cases that said that the preamble is basic structure. When the preamble got amended in 1976, there was no Supreme Court judgment that said preamble was basic structure. It is only after that when the Supreme Court said the preamble is basic structure. Anyways, out of a lot of these, so one was left out, so you have 25. There were 15 private member bills in the Rajya Sabha and 10 in the Lok Sabha that have been introduced. And they indeed have a lot of insight and a lot of innovation. For example, there was a bill on academic integrity, which basically seeks to criminalize or penalize plagiarism so that the quality of research and the integrity of formal research done by students and teachers and organizations in the country increases. So India's standing as an intellectual capital of the world comes back to its essence. Second, while we do have Ayushman Bharat and which includes state-sponsored health insurance and enhancement of primary medical care, which is again free and paid for by the government, we still don't have the concept of what is called uniform healthcare, especially in the context of the pandemic, where several people had to suffer greatly in the context of access to health organizations and infrastructure. The universal healthcare as a concept becomes exceedingly important. Universal means for everyone, irrespective of any dimension to it, whether it's economic, whether it is social, whether it is political, gender, caste, or class. And healthcare is everyone getting access to some amount of healthcare. If you are extremely rich, you may not need it. If you're extremely poor, your life will depend on it. How we are also talking about universal basic income, which is also like giving everybody a bare minimum support. Of course, the rich don't need it, but the poor's life may depend on it. Similarly, there was a bill on population control, which means that we must have organizations at the district and at the states which will monitor the rate of population and take adequate measures such as awareness and promotion campaigns to educate people to ensure that the population of the country does not become a demographic disaster instead of a demographic dividend. Apart from this, because a lot of people are confused whether private member bills can be constitutional amendments or not, they can be. The only thing private member bills cannot introduce is the budget. That's it. Everything else, even the private members can introduce. I hope all of you remember who a private member is. A private member is any MP who is not a minister. Any MP who is not a minister. Now, there have been 5 private member bills that have been thought of or tried to be introduced with respect to the Constitution. One wanted to amend the preamble. Second, we discussed a bill, I think was by KTS Tulsi, with respect to having a 3-month deadline to decide on anti-defection cases. Third was increasing the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha seats based on the 2011 census. There was also a bill wherein they wanted Chandigarh to be given representation in the Lok Sabha, and also a bill on reservation for women in the parliament. Apart from this, there was a representation of Chandigarh to the Rajya Sabha. Okay, and there was a larger bill which said that union territories which are represented to the Lok Sabha should have higher number of seats. And just like privileges, what constitutes contempt is not defined anywhere, which is why sometimes there are excessive decisions which are made on contempt, which may not necessarily be contempt. And because the word contempt finds mention in the Constitution even as a reasonable restriction under Article 19, there is an immediate need to give exact qualifications to the word contempt as far as we are concerned. Okay, so this is important. Now, so let's look at some basic explanations. See, every member of the parliament who is not a minister is called a private member. Private member bills are bills which are introduced by these MPs. In the Lok Sabha, and we discussed this, the last 2.5 hours of a sitting on every Friday are generally allotted for the transaction of private members' business, which is your private member bills and your private member resolutions. Till 2020, you are at, till today, the parliament has only passed 14 private member bills. This is not even 10% of the total number of bills that the private members often introduce. Now, 6 of these bills were actually passed in 1856 alone, which means from 1956 to 2022, if I discount 66 and only look at 1957, we've only looked at 8 bills in the last so many years. Now, this is a very disappointing data to actually understand how inclusive the parliament really is. The last private member bill, which was actually passed by the parliament, was in 1968, which means the remainder of the 8 bills were passed between 1957 to 1968, within the next 10 years or so. And since 1968, there has been no private member bill which has been passed. Okay, this is basically the enlargement of criminal appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court on the 9th of August 1970. Now, a party's average per head contribution of the private members is usually decreases when it forms the government, which means when the BJP was in opposition, there would be more private member bills than now when the BJP is in government, where it actually has more MPs and more people belonging to its party. Of course, the reason behind this is that this could often be construed by the opposition as a lack of confidence that if the government belongs to your party, then why are you introducing a bill which your government is perfectly capable of? Do you not trust the government? Do you want to wash your linen in dirty linen in public? Are basically some of the arguments that are often made. But the irony is, when you have more members as the ruling party, you would still have lesser private member bills. And the reason why you could still have more is because the government is usually busy. And just because you're an MP doesn't mean that you have direct access to ministers and you can really get behind the ministry to look at the bill that you have drafted. The ministry has set other things, which is why you are given the freedom, even if you are a BJP MP, to work on a bill and introduce it on the floor of the parliament. And then, of course, if the ministry likes what you're doing, they will really support you for it. This is what a healthy, a constructive, and unbiased, and a collaborative democracy and a parliament should ideally look like. Unfortunately, in India, that's not the case. Now, what is the basic procedure? This is technical. This does not get asked in the pre, but in the mains, when you write something like this, you get those additional points which most people will not, get. Given the fact that private member bills come in dime a dozen, it is therefore the discussion on what private member bill should be picked up or not is actually done through a ballot. Okay, and the committee of the private member bills and resolution classifies their bill according to their nature, urgency, and importance. So people basically decide which bill is one we should discuss, and the committee assists the house by saying, oh, this bill seems very important, we must really look at it, right? And then, of course, the house decides, okay, we're going to pick up these categories of bills first, and then these, and then these, and then these. So all of this depends on how the house runs, and this is how private member bills could actually be taken up for discussion. Now, once we understand this, we have to then understand the impact of private member bills. We have to then understand the impact of private member bills. See, any question on parliamentary efficiency, you can follow a simple functional approach. I have discussed the functional approach to writing answers. What are the three basic functions of the parliament? The three basic functions are: first, it is a deliberation chamber. First, it is a deliberation chamber. Second, it is a legislative chamber where you are supposed to discuss and you are supposed to assist in lawmaking. And third, you are an accountability chamber, right? Third, you are an accountability chamber. So when you are writing about private member bills, you can say its impact on deliberation. How do private member bills help the House to discuss issues better? How they drive the House towards making better laws which are in the interest of the country that the government may have forgotten. And through this, you keep reminding the ministries that there are issues that you may have, not thought of. You may have not, considered. Even if the bill does not come up for discussion on the floor of the House, at the end of the day, it is the ministry which takes notice that yes, this is an area that we should have worked on. This is an area which is extremely important and we should really get going upon. So these are the broad discussions that we usually have. These are the broad understandings that we usually have, and we can run our things accordingly. Okay, so this is important. All right. And then you can conclude by, on a positive note, that at the end of the day, we're looking at a constructive parliament, and a constructive parliament goes beyond government and opposition and should function with the primary aim of national interest. You can add any issue to these 3 points. Parliamentary committees could be analysed on these 3 points. Anti-defection law could be analysed on these 3 points. Parliamentary privileges, which we're going to do next, can also be analysed on these 3 points. Okay? Understood? Right? All right. So these are your basic understandings. You can take about 2 minutes to take a note of this, and then we will begin with parliamentary privileges. Just 2 minutes, take a note of this, and then we'll begin with parliamentary privileges. Let us move to parliamentary privileges. Sure, Ekach. If you are able to discuss bills on issues which the government ministries have forgotten to address, and then you are bringing back the attention of the parliament on it, and the ministry can then help you with the right kind of resources and assist the parliament in making the bill better through proposing amendments, you will be able to definitely determine better accountability standards. Now, when we look at parliamentary privileges, let us first look at the negative implications on our MPs and MLAs. We've discussed most of these except for parliamentary privileges, right? The first, of course, is the death of an MP. The second is, of course, the resignation of an MP or an MLA. They have voluntarily resigned from the House. Now remember, an MP has two kinds of memberships, one to the House and two to the political party. We don't care about the membership of the MP to the political party, even if the political party has suspended an MP, right? But as long as the MP is a part of the House, the MP, if is a political MP, is a party MP, will continue to vote as per the party standards, even if the House, as long as the House hasn't disqualified them, right? These are often called unattached MPs when the party has suspended you, but the House still is in the process of disqualifying you. Then you of course have disqualifications, right? Disqualifications, we studied that there are three kinds. One in the core text of the Constitution, second is in the schedule called 10th schedule called anti-defection law, and we broadly looked at this, we look at it in greater detail, called Representation of People's Act, right? Now, all of these three have something in common. Whether it is due to death, resignation or disqualification, the MP is permanently not a part of the House anymore. Like somebody has been rusticated from college, right? Now, when we say permanently, it means as long as the tenure of the House or the term of the House exists, right? So in the case of deaths, it's the story ends there. But after resignation, you can fight an election again and come back to the same house, fight a by-election and come to the other house. That's okay. That's also the case with disqualification, unless of course you have been disqualified and you've been sent to jail and then you are banned for about 6 years because of the harsh nature of your punishment. This is based on the Lily Thomas judgment, which we will cover in election reforms anyways. Then you have something called a breach of privilege. I'll tell you what this is now. A breach of privilege. Here you are suspended from the House. Suspended means either for the same session or for the next session you are not permitted to participate in the proceedings of the House. Okay, so this is what is called a breach of privilege. This is the termination of the MP or the MLA. This is the suspension of an MP or an MLA. With this in mind, we should now understand parliamentary privileges. Okay, so let us start. What are parliamentary privileges? Parliamentary privileges refers to the rights and the immunities enjoyed by the Parliament as an institution and their MPs in their individual capacity, without which they cannot discharge their functions as entrusted upon them by the Constitution. Without which they cannot discharge their functions as entrusted upon them by the Constitution. Okay? Now you must understand what are the rights and immunities that we're talking about of the Parliament and of the members of the Parliament. This is equivalent for state legislatures and MLAs/MLCs. Okay, so according to the Constitution, the powers, the privileges and the immunities of the Parliament and the MPs are to be defined by the Parliament. Okay, they have to be defined by the Parliament. The Constitution in itself does not give you what is immunity, what is the right, and so on and so forth. Right? Now, till today, we do not have a law with respect to this. Till today, we do not have a law with respect to this. And in the absence of such law, we are still following the broad conventions from the British form of government. Now, let's understand this. A breach of privilege, which means a violation of the protections that has been given to you, is a violation of any of the privileges of the MPs or the Parliament. Anything, I mean, it could be 10 other things, but anything which is any action causing reflections on MPs, which means saying something against the MPs or the Parliament or the committees, could be considered a breach of privilege. So what is contempt of court against the court and judges is parliamentary privilege against the MPs or the Parliament, right? This may include publishing of news items, editorials made in newspaper, magazines, TV interviews, or public speeches, right? Suppose you say something on those fronts. Like, for example, a common mistake people think is when the Lok Sabha MP Mahua Mitra had made a very, very strong worded speech accusing the judiciary of, being biased and casting aspersions on it. She was able to do that primarily because she had the parliamentary immunity of being an MP. Basically, nobody can touch you for how you vote and how you speak on the floor of the house, which means you can't be sent to jail or you can't be fined for how you speak and how you vote on the floor of the Parliament. You will be disqualified for anti-defection law. That's a different story. But you cannot be criminally penalized for it. You cannot be criminally charged for it. This is what is meant by parliamentary privilege. Okay? Now, if Mahua Mitra had made the same speech outside the Parliament, then she certainly may have been charged with contempt of court. All right. What are the privileges? Why are we referring to them? The privileges and immunities which are enjoyed by MPs and MLAs include: 1. The freedom of speech in the House, which means they cannot be prosecuted for saying or doing anything in the House. They also have the freedom of arrest 40 days before or after a session or during a session or from the premises of the legislature without the permission of the House, which means apart from this, even if an MP has committed murder, right? There is a complaint that has been filed on it. The MP cannot be arrested 40 days before a session, during a session, or 40 days after a session. Okay? And the legislature has the powers to regulate its internal affairs that covers the behavior including disruptions, vandalism, and violence. So vandalism is destruction of parliamentary property, disruptions is not letting the House proceed, and violence is basically any form of physical or verbal violence against the other members of the House or even the staff of the House. And the police or the courts cannot interfere in this because of rule number 3, which is separation of powers. However, nobody else but the House can punish you for what you do to the House. So, you can be punished for the breach of privileges by the House itself, and you may be sent to jail, you may be fined, or you may be suspended, or all out of the 3. So in that sense, the Parliament is also performing a judicial function, an extrajudicial function, a quasi-judicial function. wherein they're determining whether the MP actually committed the privilege, and they're basically sentencing somebody to jail. They are basically sentencing somebody to jail. Okay, so that is what are your basic privileges. Now, once we understand what the basic privileges are, we must understand, are they legal or not? Are they constitutionally valid or not? See, the powers and privileges and immunities of the Parliament and its members are laid down in 105 of the Constitution, and 194 is for your state legislatures and state legislative members. Now, the elected representatives can claim these privileges only during the period for which they're a member of the House. If you were a member 10 years ago, you can't still claim constitutional privileges. Yes, absolutely, Vaibhav. Third, the argument has also been that it is necessary for exercising constitutional functions, which is that the Parliament is supposed to be deliberating. It is also an accountability chamber. And if you do not give the freedom to the members of the Parliament to say what they have to speak the bitter truth, the truth will never come out. And that is why. So, and this is actually something that you can use in ethics as an example also. So, on one hand, you want to make sure there is a freedom of MPs to ensure parliamentary accountability, and on the other hand, this immunity could be misused. Because if I am free from any consequences for whatever I say and how I vote on the floor of the House, then in such a scenario, I could either take money for how I'm supposed to vote, or I could say anything which could be extremely hurtful and sensitive and can have overarching effects in the country and still sort of get away with it. So, as much as this is a legal issue, it also happens to be what is called an ethical issue, right? All members. Now, let's look at some examples of this, right? The House can therefore, while taking up the proceedings of this, can ensure the attendance of the offending person. The person can be given a warning and also can be sent off to prison as the case might be. Now, in 1967, two people were held to be in contempt of Rajya Sabha for having thrown leaflets from the visitors' gallery. They were greatly inspired by some revolutionary freedom fighters. The only thing is they could not throw a bomb, so they threw leaflets, right? In 1983, one person was held again in contempt for shouting slogans and throwing chappals from the visitors' gallery, that you are not functioning to the best interest of the country. All of these three people were actually sent to prison. Now, another very interesting case in 2007 was where there was a case against Ambassador Ronan Sen, right? With respect to in 2007, the case of breach of privilege against Ambassador Ronan Sen. What basically happened was, Ronan Sen was a foreign services officer. Okay. Now, what this person did was, he, while giving some interview, said that the Parliament is a headless chicken, right? Now, the Lok Sabha Committee on Privileges held, it was not used by Shri Sen in the respect of MPs or politicians. It was, and therefore no action was taken against him. And it depends from committee to committee, issue to issue. In 2008, an editor of an Urdu weekly referred to the deputy chairman of the Rajya Sabha as a coward, attributing motives to a decision taken by the chairperson. And then the Privileges Committee also held the editor guilty. Now, let me map all of this for you. See, when we talk about parliamentary privileges, and you can draw this diagram in your mains answers also, it refers to the parliament and its MPs, and it is correlationally same for legislatures at the states. This is under 194. This is under Article 105. Now, there are two sets of people who can commit these kind of breach of privileges. First, anyone outside the parliament and anyone on the floor of the parliament as well. Okay, outside the parliament and inside the parliament as well. You basically, inside the parliament, you have immunity for how you speak and how you vote, no matter what you say, right? So, therefore, this is rarely ever used. Inside the parliament, you will mostly see issues of vandalism and disruptions which count as parliamentary privileges. Outside the parliament, what you speak, vote does not count here because you're not on the floor. Vandalism as well as disruptions. This is how it happens, and this is outside the parliament by anyone, and inside the parliament by the members. Okay. I'll give you 1 minute, you can take a note of this. Yes, Ekansh. All right. Now, let's give you some more recent data. The monsoon session of 2021 was the third least productive session of the Lok Sabha in the last 2 decades. This had a lot to do. This has a lot to do with your farm law and your CAA and your related issues. Okay? Now, the worst session in terms of productivity for both the houses was the winter session of 2010. That's when the 2G spectrum scam had broken out. And the winter sessions of 2013 and 2016 were the second worst hit in terms of the productivity. This was because of the Telangana issue and the demonetization issue. Yesterday I also explained to you how the government had delayed the winter session in one of its Lok Sabhas, primarily due to the Telangana disruptions, right? And of course demonetization broke havoc. Now, last year in March 2020, 7 Congress MP, I've heard of these guys: Gauran Gogoi, T.N. Prathapan, Manikam Tagore, Gurjeet Singh, Benny Behanan, Rajmohan Unnithan and Advocate Dean Kuriakose. They were all suspended from the Lok Sabha for the rest of the budget session. They were accused of snatching papers from the Speaker's table as the opposition strongly demanded a discussion on the Delhi riots. Okay, so this is, these are our MPs. I don't have anything else to say but to just tell you that things like these have happened. Now, this is something which most people don't get right. Now, you don't need to know directly the judgment, you just need to know in 2021, the Supreme Court gave a remarkable judgment. Okay, now this judgment, why do we don't need to worry about the name of it, is because this does not directly deal with the parliament but actually with state legislatures. The Supreme Court basically made some poetic observations. The Supreme Court ruled that elected representatives could no longer go scot-free for acts of vandalism and violence committed inside a house, claiming immunity under the Constitution, which means you cannot use immunity as a shield, as an excuse for letting you do what you want. Like, for example, when a child is small, the child is often considered a bundle of cuteness, a bundle of softness. That does not mean the child can come break your gadgets, right? So when children unnecessarily, they are fiddling, they are fidgety in nature, they break your phones, they break your laptops, you will school the child, you will tell the child that this can't be done. And I hope you appreciate the irony that we are treating our MPs equivalent to children for how they misuse their privileges. Right? So that's exactly what the Supreme Court also said. The Supreme Court says, boss, your protection for privileges and immunities that make you, immune from prosecution, this does not exist if there is destruction of property. The Supreme Court said, destruction of property, now we're talking about this from an assembly's context, cannot be equated to freedom of speech in the House. Privileges and immunities are not a gateway to claim exemptions from criminal law. That would be a betrayal to its citizens. And third, the purpose why you set up these privileges was enabled to perform their legislative functions without hindrance or without fear or favor, and legislators will therefore will therefore work within the public trust parameters to do their duties. Don't misuse the powers that have been given to you. With great power comes great responsibility. So as per this 2021 Supreme Court judgment, for state legislatures, immunities does not extend to destruction of property. Now, if this can be applied to legislatures, it can also be applied to the parliament, largely because the immunities enjoyed by MPs and MLAs are exactly the same. There is absolutely no difference of any kind, no matter what, when it comes to the immunities. Okay? Understood this? Clear? All right. Now, solutions. The National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution, as well as several private think tanks such as PRS, have all recommended something called a Parliament Disruption Index. The idea originally came up when there was a conference of the presiding officers of legislative bodies in Dehradun in 19, in the backdrop of the disruptions in the Parliament. So you know how it was basically that all the speakers and deputy speakers, everybody, the chairpersons and vice chairpersons met in the beautiful hill station called Dehradun, which now no longer is a hill station. It's as commercially a capital as most other capitals, and said that we should have a parliamentary disruption index, which basically means ranking the houses and its members with respect to the disruptions that they cause. This is like your red card, yellow card system in football. And once you've crossed a certain threshold, then actions must be taken. And similarly, automatic suspension of members who cause disruption, then we will have a committee hearing and see whether you should be taken back. I mean, if you think about it, when, say, a police officer is charged with brutality, right? The first thing you do is you suspend the police officer pending the inquiry that would be conducted, and then the inquiry will decide with the future of the police officer. But you don't let the police officer continue until everybody else has decided. So if you can hold the permanent executive to such high standards, theoretically, you should also hold the elected executive to similarly high standards, right? Now, in the exam, this is more than enough. If you ever get a question, you have enough information to write about, all of these. Now, let's look at parliamentary committees. I think this is a long topic, so you can now take a proper 5-minute break, and then I will teach you parliamentary committees in one flow. Okay, don't worry, we'll keep taking breaks every 1 hour or so that you don't feel burdened. You can wash up the screens, wash up your eyes while staring at the screens. Today is a long class. My agenda is to finish this entirely and then move to the next theme. Okay, so go ahead. All right. Now we will look at the analysis of parliamentary committee. We've done the basics of parliamentary committees already. We already know our constitutional provisions on it. We've already discussed the broad organization of them. We've already done a basic review of what are the kind of committees that exist. Now let's start with the analysis of it. Why do they exist? Are they doing their job well? And what can they do to basically do a better kind of a job? Let's start. The purpose of parliamentary committee, and you can still use the functional format, deliberation, legislation and parliamentary accountability, and you can fit these points under the whole deliberation, legislation and the accountability framework to get better organizational structures in your answers. Now, let's understand the fundamental purpose of parliamentary committees. 1. A parliamentary committee focus on remedying the legislative infirmity of debate on the floor of the House. Now let's understand this. What does this mean? What does the word legislative infirmity means? Legislative means legislative. Infirmity means the inconsistency and the lack of quality and quantity with respect to something. So the problem with the parliament today is, and we were discussing this in a previous year question as far as the prelims is concerned, is that the parliament meets for less than 100 days in a year. And even in these 100 days, your actual legislative business is only in the second half of that day, which means you're effectively just doing work for approximately less than 50 days a year. The actual job of the parliament of passing laws is actually 50 days in the year, because you spend half of the time on your other tools of parliamentary democracy, which means you will not have enough time to discuss the bill in the detail on the floor of the House, which will therefore not get the right kind of examinations that are needed. And most of the debates that happen on the floor of the House are regulated through anti-defection law, which means people will not speak what they truly want to. They will not be technical. They will not get into the intricacies of it. And therefore, it will be a very superficial discussion, even if there is a discussion on a bill on the floor of the House. And that is why this point gets to you answering the question of quality legislative processes better. Now, a parliamentary committee discharges a very important function of making the administration accountable to the parliament by, of course, asking questions, calling members of the parliament of the administration, seeking their opinions, asking them, summoning them to be before the parliamentary committee. For example, if there is a law on increasing the marriage age from 18 to 21, and if that law was referred to a standing committee, then in such a scenario, the standing committee would have summoned the law secretary or summoned, the experts and asked their opinions on the same. Now, how does a bill actually reach a parliamentary committee? 3. The first is the minister introducing the bill themselves recommend that this should be examined by a select committee or a joint committee of the houses. This is when this recommendation comes formally from the government, which makes it very easy for the House and for the presiding officer to then do the needful. Second, the presiding officer on their own, by the application of their own mind and wisdom, can also decide to send a bill to a parliamentary committee. This was heavily in news with respect to the farm law debates, because the farm laws, when they were originally passed, they were passed without a proper discussion. And if a bill was so controversial or sensitive in nature, it should have been sent to a standing committee, right? And then a bill passed by one house can be sent to the other house to its select committees, and that's also possible. Okay, understood, right? Now, a committee's report is recommendatory in nature and is not binding on the government, and the committee can also suggest its own version of the bill. The committee can also suggest its own version of the bill, which means that, for example, with the National Medical Commission, I was telling you about this. You can just remove almost all the substantive provisions and recommend that these new provisions should be added. Now it is entirely up to both the houses of the parliament as to whether they accept your recommendations, they accept your suggestions, and they really want to take that into account, and they really want to make a better and a more qualitative bill or not. Okay, so these are the basic points that are there. Now let's go further. The advantages which I have mentioned here, they can also be further sort of categorized. Efficiency and transparency leads to better laws, better accountability, and better deliberation. Expert knowledge leads to better laws. Inclusive participation means better deliberation, and unbiased and objective discussions again means better deliberation. Okay, now let me give you some data points to make you understand where we are and what is happening. Right now, in the last 10 years, the parliament on an average has met for 67 days on average. This is a short time for MPs to be able to get into the depth of the matters. And the parliament is supposed to get into matters which are so complex, which requires some amount of technical expertise. And the committees, of course, provide this for as an opportunity with domain officials and government officials and so on and so forth. For example, if there was an amendment to right to education, and if that amendment had to be referred to a parliamentary committee, the parliamentary committee has the powers to summon any education expert, any social activist that they think is necessary. Now, for example, in 2016, the Committee of Health and Family Welfare, which essentially is a departmental standing committee in the parliament, when they were studying the Surrogacy Bill of 2016, which, by the way, stops or the bill now says that commercial surrogacy is illegal but altruistic is. Commercial surrogacy is when a person rents their womb to another person in exchange for some money or other consideration. And altruistic surrogacy is you're doing it because you want to help a childless couple, enjoy the privileges of having a child. Okay. Now, as MPs come from varying backgrounds, they've not had the expertise to understand the details, and because MPs, and let's be very honest, they're not particularly very well educated. A few of them are, most of them aren't. And a lot of them will not even have an opinion on this. If you ask the average MP in the country the difference between commercial and altruistic surrogacy, you would be bowled over with their responses. We've had politicians in the country who said cloud computing is a problem because what if the cloud has rainfall? When people say things like these, I honestly start having doubts on the future of humanity itself, right? And when the education minister of the country says that astrology is a science, no, it's not. Okay, so of course, as MPs come from varying backgrounds, they may not have and you can't write it like that. So you'll say they don't have the expertise to understand the technical details, such as fertility, abortion, the regulation of it, the misuse of it. And that is why this committee invited a bunch of stakeholders, from doctors to National Commission for Women to government officials, before they finalized their report. Now, the committees also provide a forum for building consensus across political parties. Now, what is this supposed to mean? What this is supposed to mean here is that anti-defection law really does not apply to parliamentary committee proceedings, because this is not happening on the floor of the house. and the MPs across political parties are also able to speak more freely to the best of your ability and in the best interest of the matter. And that is how you're able to build not only intra-party consensus but inter-party consensus. So when a bill has been vetted through a parliamentary committee and has reached the floor of the House, it has reached the floor of the House with the background support of all parties together, thereby making the passage of the bill far easier. Okay, now the proceedings of the House are televised. As I've said before, they're obviously going to stick to their own matters of position because anti-defection law, the whip is watching you. Committees therefore have closed door meetings and you can freely question. Even BJP MPs in a parliamentary committee can question what is the point of a farm law. But the same when they go out on the floor of the parliament or they're giving a media interview, farm laws are essential. They're absolutely essential. Same goes for Congress MPs who had opposed farm laws. It's not a bad idea. But when they go out and they give television debates or they are on the floor of the parliament, farm laws are the death of the country. So that kind of problems of course exist, right? Now then there is an issue of what happens. See, a parliamentary committee is a committee which is a subset of the highest democratic temple in the country. And once they have submitted a report, it cannot be a poorly drafted report. It cannot be incompetent in terms of its, its range of study, its scope of study. They are often hiring the best of the think tanks, the best of the policy consultants, and a lot of these think tanks and policy consultants are actually ex-UPSC aspirants, by the way. And they are the ones who help, do immaculate research because you're able to then give a lot of evidence-related suggestions, not only from India, from all over the world. And these recommendations, therefore, actually hold a lot of weight. And for example, with respect to National Medical Commission, I was telling you about this. The original National Medical Commission actually had a provision called a bridge course for Ayush practitioners. Now, Ayush practitioners are Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, Siddhi and Homeopathy. Now, what happens with this is, with Ayush practitioners is that the original bill, which didn't get passed, said that they could do a 6-month course and they would be able to practice ordinary medicine like other doctors. And the medical fraternity flared up. They said, are we idiots for studying for 20 years of our life and, having compromised and sacrificed everything in such a competitive world, and we worked in the most difficult situations, and now you're saying that this Ayurvedic doctor can come and apply haldi during a bypass surgery and will therefore be allowed to do the same thing as us? This is preposterous and we will not stand for it. And the medical council at that time, which is replaced by the National Medical Commission, also took very strong objection to this. And the Parliamentary Committee also recommended that this part should be deleted, and it was deleted and it doesn't have it anymore. So there are no bridge courses available. This was largely done upon the recommendations. Most recently, the Committee on Labour had recommended a lot of changes when we were doing a merging or a consolidation of labour codes for industrial relations, for internal for wages, for security and all of those things, right? Now, for all of those things, when these particular issues were happening, what the Labour Committee did was, it recommended more than 100 changes. And I think about 75% of those changes were actually accepted by the Parliament, and the requisite changes were made to the bill before the bill, actually passed. So if you think about it, there is of course a good way to go about it. There are enough reasons to go about it, right? Now, again, say Parliament, the Consumer Protection Act of 2019, right? Shaurya, you can't disqualify an MP under anti-defection law for how they are speaking in a parliamentary committee meeting. It's that simple. So, for example, the Consumer Protection Act of 2019 overhauling the 1986 law was done recently in the previous budget session. Now, the earlier version of the bill had been re-examined by the Committee on Food and Consumer Affairs, and which suggested several amendments such as increasing penalties, misleading advertisements, etc., etc., etc. The government accepted most of these recommendations and incorporated them in the 2019 Act, and which is why the 2019 Consumer Protection Act, which basically replaces the old 86 law, is a far stronger consumer protection law. It's a far, far stronger consumer protection law. Now, apart from this, you must also understand the other kind of works that they do. Now, see, this is something I wanted to show you as a diagrammatic representation. These are actual data sets. See, if compare it to the 14th, 15th and 16th, we can't compare the 17th Lok Sabha entirely yet because the 17th Lok Sabha is not finished yet. But if you see, and this is where if you must analyze and we'll come back to this discussion in just a bit. But if you see, if these are the amount of bills that are introduced in the 14th Lok Sabha, you had 60% of those bills, which is a healthy number, which was referred to a parliamentary committee. In the 15th Lok Sabha, this number was even higher, which is 71%. But from the previous Lok Sabha onwards, there has been a sharp decline in the number of bills that have been referred to a parliamentary committee. No, Aryan, don't ask. No, you can't. Okay. Anyway, so the latest data says only 25% of the committees bills are referred to committees, which is of course a very, very dangerous number and a very, very disheartening number to begin with. Right now, when we look at it from a DRRC points of view, see, the departmentally related standing committees also examine the budget. The detailed estimates of expenditure, called demand for grants, are often sent to DRRCs. They study the demands, the allocations, they look at markets, they understand what are the kind of policy priorities that you've made. And honestly, only a limited proportion of the budget is actually discussed on the floor of the House. In fact, in the recently dissolved 16th Lok Sabha, only 17% of the budget was actually discussed in the House. And this is, of course, very, very problematic. I'll give you like a very simple example. Because of the pandemic, you didn't discuss anything, but only 20% of the budget actually gets discussed in the parliament last year. Now, in 19 to 20. Now, 2021 data is yet to come out yet, and I'll update this when it comes out. This number is also not going to be beyond 20% or so. Okay, so we are in a very, very bad shape, which is why these committees become very important. Think about it, that this is how the country is going to spend the money, and basically 80% of how the money is going to be spent is going to be decided by 15% of the members of 15% of the strength of the Lok Sabha, equivalent to the 15% who are ministers, who therefore also come from the Rajya Sabha. So not even 100 people are deciding how 80% of the country's money is going to be spent. And that is sort of a data interpretation that you can use in your exams, right? Now, that's of course something that we must look at. Okay. Apart from this, apart from budgets, they also look into bills, demand for grants, issues, and sort of publish about 503 action reports. So the committees have done well. Apart in terms of the bills, about 41 bills were looked into by them, about 331 demand for grants over 5 years. Okay, and remember this is departmental, right? And of course, submit certain reports for what they could have done with respect to certain actions. Okay, so this data is not updated yet. Once we have the data, I'll give you the data. Okay. Now, issues involved. Let's look at the issues involved. See, simple issues. lesser bills are being referred. The problem that exists with ministries, with bureaucrats is also the same here. That, for example, you don't get to be a bureaucrat, you don't get to be a district magistrate for long enough in the same district. You get frequently posted out. As a result, the time that it takes for you to really understand the demands of the district and what your aspirations are for the development of the district, by that time both of these things come to fruition, your posting orders are often due. Right? The ARC has very rightly noted that the average tenure of a collector in a district is not even 2 years. It's in fact less than a year also sometimes. So, and the average, some of you may stay in for 2 years, some of you may stay in for 2.5, that's okay. But most people don't. Right? So that's the problem at the lower bureaucracy level. At the higher bureaucracy level where you have secretaries and all, that's also the same problem, that you don't get to be a secretary of a ministry long enough for you to really see through certain actions, certain projects taken by the ministry in the first place. And that is why the longer system, the committee system, allows for a smaller group of legislators to develop technical expertise. But because most of these committees, the composition changes after 1 year, there is a sort of discontinuity in the kind of work they wanted to do. Third is, at the end of the day, they're examining qualitatively what the bill should be like. And this is an academic exercise, this is an intellectual exercise. And as this is an academic or an intellectual exercise, it would definitely require some form of research infrastructure, some form of research support for you to get these basic principles right. And that is something that we must really, really work forward to. Right? Now, apart from this, we should also have a secretariat. We should also have research fellowships where people can work even if in a lateral entry capacity to make the work of these parliamentary committees better. And apart from this, while the committee may put in all the effort it can, and while the committee can really do an excellent job out of it, but the parliament must also take the recommendations very seriously. You're as serious as the person standing in front of you wants to take you. Then of course, in these committees also, we have the same attendance issues that often don't get resolved, right? And because these committees are often attached to many ministries, as I was telling you, so education, youth, supports, culture, all of them sort of come in the same domain. It becomes very difficult for these ministries to really do the kind of work with the limited resources they have within the given time that they could. And what usually happens is that though there are certain norms, there are certain conventions that you should have diverse participation, but most political parties don't do that. Most political parties let things be as they are in the course of their discussions. Okay, so these are of course some of the issues, and if there are issues, there are always going to be solutions, recommendations. I'll give you the recommendations. See. First, you have to strengthen committees so that they can scrutinize their reports in a timely manner. Second, the discussion of the committees must be encouraged in the parliament. Third, you should have a constitution committee which can examine constitutional amendments before they're directly presented in the House as ordinary bills. And don't worry about it. It does not necessarily mean simple majority, but like any other bill, this ordinary here refers to like any other bill. First, take it to the committee, let the committee examine it, because constitutional amendments are serious in nature. Constitutional amendments require a sense of depth, require a sense of understanding. Then you of course have an oversight committee to oversee effective and proper functioning of other committees. You should have a committee like this. You should have a committee to look into the functions of other committees, right? And then you should have greater public participation, especially in the post-pandemic age. You could have webinars, you could have live sessions. You could just generally have anybody be a part of this and give their suggestions. Then you should also have a defined procedure, or at least some rules of the Lok Sabha, some rules of the Rajya Sabha, wherein X number of bills must be referred, Y type of bills should not be referred. And then At the end of the day, if you're evaluating the performance of bureaucrats, if you're evaluating the performance of MPs, you should also be evaluating the performance of judges. So you should also be evaluating the performances of the committees, of the parliament as well as a whole, so that we understand exactly what it is that they do, how sufficiently effective they are, and how they are not. And a qualitative study will therefore enjoy, and therefore will entail into how is an MP participating, like a basic group discussion kind of a thing. What are the kind of technical expertise that you're bringing to the house, right? These are the overall suggestions. Now, some of these suggestions were given by the National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution in 2002. They've given some additional suggestions, such as having a committee on national economy to look at a macroeconomic analysis. Constitution Committee was also recommended by them. And third, have a larger committee called the Committee on Legislations, which can plan what kind of bills should be introduced over the year, or each a bunch of sessions, and so far, so on and so forth, right? So these are some of the discussions that have happened with respect to parliamentary committees. Now, there are some international examples. You don't have to remember them, but just in case you want to quote them, like for example, in the UK, you also have the concept of a select committee, a joint committee, a general committee, and a grant committee. There was the Murdoch scandal in the UK, where there were spying that was basically members of the royal family were being spied upon, and a local media tabloid was making money out of it. It was a big scandal in the UK. So again, they have committees. These committees look on a larger question. But what is very important to note here is most committees here provide for allowing public hearing and televising of the meetings, which makes a lot of difference, really. Second is the US. Very recently, I think Aam Aadmi Party, in through one of their parliamentary committee legislative committee meetings, had invited members of Facebook, and that meeting was also televised. So very interesting. Then the US. With respect to the US, again, you have 20 Senate and 21 House committees, 5 joint committees, and subcommittees. You don't have to worry about the numbers. The basic explanation is here is that they can also have public hearings, and US has really, really nailed it when it comes to the parliamentary system. Google, Facebook, you've had judges being appeared for sexual harassment issues. You've had all sorts of meetings, all sorts of public hearings on issues with respect to problems in the US. Even Canada also has a lot of committees. Now, today Canada is in the news largely because of the truckers' protest, and there are some parallels being drawn as to what the truckers' protest in Canada would be a correlation to the farm law protests in India, right? Now, this covers your parliamentary committees. You can take a 2-minute break, and then we'll start with state legislative councils. This was already asked last year, so I don't see the reason for it to be asked again, but I'll quickly run you through it, and I expect you to just go through it. So you can just read through it in the next 5 minutes, and I'll quickly sort of run you through the process of it. Okay? All right. Okay. Now let's look at state legislative councils very, very quickly. We understand that while the Lok Sabha and the state legislative, Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, yes, Sumit, after the class, please. Now, while the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha are equal in all respects except for money bills and certain powers that the Rajya Sabha has, but the Lok Sabha doesn't. But in the case of assemblies versus councils, the assemblies are more powerful and can override the councils on all matters. Now, why are we talking about this is because last year the elections had happened in West Bengal, and the Chief Minister of West Bengal had lost her election to a BJP opponent. Now, this obviously was a matter of great surprise, and therefore the government thought that we must always have a backup in case of something which is as uneventual or eventual as this. And that is why the government of West Bengal through the Legislative Assembly passed a resolution that we would like a legislative council. And as you would know, it is the parliament who actually creates the legislative council. The decision still has not been taken by the parliament on the matter. Now, Article 169, Clause 1 of the Constitution allows the Parliament to either create or abolish a council if the Assembly passes a resolution to that effect with a special majority, which is a majority of the total membership of the Assembly and a majority of not less than 2/3 of the members of the Assembly present and voting, which means more than 2/3 of the present and voting. Now, the parliament which is creating or abolishing a legislative assembly, this is not considered as a constitutional amendment under 368, and therefore a simple majority is required by the parliament, whereas you would require a special majority by the legislatures to request the parliament to do so. Now, at present there are 6 states, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, UP, Maharashtra, Bihar and Karnataka, where councils are in existence. Now, Jammu and Kashmir also had one, but when we had the Reorganization Act of 2019, where they have been converted into 2 union territories, one with legislatures and one without legislatures, the Legislative Council does not exist. You do not have a Legislative Council for union territories. Okay, you only have it for states. Now, let's understand very simply and very broadly what the basic explanations are. As far as the composition is concerned, this Article 171 Clause 1 says you will not have more than 1/3 of the total strength of the assembly, and you will not have lesser than 40 members. Now, we've sort of covered this in our comparative table also, and it is also continuing chamber, and therefore one MLC member gets to be there for 6 years. I've also done this with you before, 1/3, 1/3, 1/6, 1/6, and then of course 1/3, 1/3, 1/12, 1/12 and 1/6, right? So this is exactly how your nominations happen, your elections happen. We've covered this before, right? Now, when you compare it with the Rajya Sabha, there is absolutely no non-financial legislation powers that have been specially given to the councils. The assemblies can override the suggestions and any amendments that are made by the council. There is no provision for a joint sitting or a deadlock. And while the Rajya Sabha MPs are a part of the electorate to choose the president, the legislative council members are not. I've explained this to you before, largely because it's not uniform in nature. And the chairperson of the Rajya Sabha is the Vice President of India, but that is not true for Legislative Council, that the Deputy Governor is going to be the chairperson of the Legislative Council. Both the chairperson and the vice chairperson of the Legislative Councils are chosen from within the House through a simple majority and are removed through an effective majority. Now, why did you create something like this? You see, India fundamentally acknowledges and accepts the principle of a bicameral system, wherein you have 2 divisions or 2 methods of legislative scrutiny, right? Now, the state can also have this, and a lot of this is dependent on the population of the state and the will of the state to create an additional chamber Because once you have a legislative council, I understand that you can override it, but unless they first give you something to override, you can't move past it, right? And therefore, it acts as a check and balance on hasty and populist actions by the directly elected House. It therefore also facilitates diversity in the legislative process by the provisions of the nomination of the non-elected individuals. It enhances the representation of local bodies in legislation, as they are given rights to elect 1/3 of the members of the Legislative Council. Okay, 1/3 of the members of the Legislative Council, and this is broadly the rationale for the creation of the House. Okay, understood this, right? Now, but I don't want this. Okay. All right. Sorry. No. All right. Now, why are they being criticized? They criticize because sometimes this is like a backdoor chamber, right? What usually ends up happening is it is often considered superfluous or mischievous in nature. I'll explain to you why. See, if the majority of the members of the upper house belong to the same party which have the majority in the lower house, it just becomes a ditto chamber. Like a lot of the people, right? Oh, maybe. No, but I was clicking on in the window, there's nothing called an eraser tool as such, right? Yeah. Anyways, so with respect to legislative councils, they're often considered mischievous and superfluous because suppose there is political party A which is in majority in the state legislative council. Now you know that you have a fair indication that you may be losing the next election. So in the state legislative councils, you start your core members start resigning from here, and you start making them members in the legislative councils, or you get your party people only to become legislative council members by some electoral advantage. Then this becomes a 2.0 version of the assembly. It doesn't make any difference in the first place, right? So that is why there'll be a problem. And if two parties are in majority, two different parties, then the upper house will unnecessarily delay the bills. And when you start delaying the bills, I understand the assembly can override it, but there's going to be an unnecessary delay in the houses. Okay, now let's understand this. This is not an effective check. This is not an effective check. See, powers of the legislative councils are limited, but hardly impose any effective check on the assemblies. Now, you must understand this because even if the bill is approved by the council or not, The assembly will have 4 months and will override it in all circumstances. And there will always be a sense of vested interest that the council only serves as a stronghold in the vested interest of the people who are not interested in legislation. They're just here to either create a political blockade or to essentially, support the whims and fancies. And suppose you've lost a major election, then, like for example, in Mamta Didi, you would want her to come to the council as a member of the council. So if you can do this for the chief minister, you can do this for everybody else as well, right? And then you have the fact that it is a very expensive institution. I mean, any house is very expensive. You'll at least have about 300, 400 people working in and around the house. You'll have members who have to be paid salaries. There's infrastructure. There's a lot of other money that has to be paid in at all given points of time. And that makes it extremely expensive to really run things from the way up. And these are, of course, the issues. Now, how do we make them better? So you should have a national policy on this, where only on these considerations should the houses be made, and you should probably have a change in the kind of powers that have been given, so that whether all legislatures should have it or not, or none of them should have it, you should have some form of a uniform policy on it. Okay. Now, I just wanted to give you some form of data as well with respect to how the houses have performed over the last few years. Okay. You will use this. I'll keep updating this even next year also. But see, you are at an advantage that you are writing your exam in the middle of the Lok Sabha. So the fundamental comparisons don't change. Year to year productivity data changes, but overall assessments don't change. Okay, so the 16th Lok Sabha data review, which happens, which is basically figuring out how the 16th Lok Sabha worked, you'll see, मतलब 5 साल में, मुझे शर्म आ रही है बोलते हुए, 5 साल में आपने 133 bills पास करे, and there were 45 ordinances, मतलब 45 ordinances which were promulgated. मतलब तुम्हारे 5 साल में कितना हुआ? Approximately say 25 on an average, 27 bills on a yearly basis, and you are meeting 3 times a year. तुमसे साल भर में 26-27 बिल नहीं पास हो रहे हैं. Do you understand the problem here? Do you understand what is it that we are? Yes, this is why. Yeah. Of course, and this is why productivity is a question mark. Second is, the 16th Lok Sabha had the second lowest hours of work done by the Lok Sabha in any full-term Lok Sabha. 16th is 2014 to 19. While they discussed there were more times for bills, but they were scrutinized less in committees. Okay. When we look at the 17th Lok Sabha, we understand we're currently in the process of it. Out of the 543 MPs, 397 have been elected from national parties, which means this is a classification given where you get some airtime, you won an X number of seats before, so you have a national party status. We'll cover this in electoral reforms. And out of these, 303 MPs were from the BJP, 52 from the Congress, and 22 from the Trinamool Congress. Right? Among state parties, DMK and YSRCP, they have won the most amount of seats. And in the 17th Lok Sabha, there are 267 MPs who've become MPs for the first time. Now, don't worry, this is a decent enough number, or on average it remains the same. There were 230. There were out of 267 MPs who were having their first term. From the previous Lok Sabha, 230 are back again. Right? They've been re-elected to the Lok Sabha. Okay, and otherwise 45 of them have been old timers. They've been here for the last 15-20 years. But what is very interesting to note is the number of re-elected MPs is significantly higher than the last election or than the last few elections. 230 re-elections is crazy, which is why, of course, when you see the 16th and 17th Lok Sabha, you see that basically the same party has come back to power, but with a greater majority, right? So that's, of course, the case. This is how it is. This is how it will be, right? So 16th Lok Sabha, 17th Lok Sabha, first term re-elected was an MP in an earlier Lok Sabha. There are a good number, numbers that we are dealing with, right? Of course, in the 16th Lok Sabha, you had even a higher number. You had 314 first-term MPs. It's now reduced to a significant number by 267. But again, all you need to know is that this is what you can quote in the exam. You don't have to worry about data here. This is just to explain to you how things are running in the country. Okay. Now I'll use a yellow ink. I just realized I'll use a red ink. Okay. Now let's look at other forms of data. See, first things first, there are very few MPs who are over 70 years, but and there are definitely more MPs who are under 40 years. So we're improving our demographic sort of composition, but the average age of an MP in India still remains about 54 years. The proportion of MPs below 40 years has obviously steadily declined from 26% in the first Lok Sabha. In the very first Lok Sabha. Okay. In the first Lok Sabha, we had incredibly young MPs. मैं first Lok Sabha की बात कर रहा हूँ, 1950 वाली, ठीक है? And then of course, when you look at education as a composition, we understand that since 1996, at least 75% of each of the Lok Sabha members have been graduates. तो जब हम लोग ऐसे ताव में बोल देते हैं ना कि पढ़े लिखे नहीं हैं, 75% of them are graduates. Are they real graduates or fake graduates, or have they studied during graduation or not, is a different story. But are they graduates? They're absolutely graduates. No questions about that. And these 394 MPs have at least graduate level education across both the houses. Okay? Understood this? So this is largely your education and your age review. You can use these in your exams actually. Then when we look at gender and the parliament, in the current Lok Sabha, we have about 78 women MPs. What is very interesting to notice, more than 700 contested and only about 78 were elected. And of course, most of these 78 come from powerful political backgrounds. That is something you must remember. Though there is a massive improvement in terms of the number of MPs, but this is still negligible. Today, women MPs are 14% of the 17th Lok Sabha, when half the country's population are women. In the first Lok Sabha, we had 5%, right? So it's not that we've gone very, we've performed very well on it, right? But there is, of course, if you compare it to the rest of the countries, say for example in Rwanda, Rwanda is a fantastic example of women empowerment, largely also because of the Rwandan genocide, where women were therefore, responsible for a lot of leadership and a lot of family positions, as a result of which Rwanda is the only country in the world which has a legally guaranteed reservation for women across all levels: center, state, local, judicial, legislative, as well as executive, right? 61%. South Africa has 43%, UK has 32%, Bangladesh has 21%, US has 24%, India is 14%. So हमारा देश महान नहीं है, लेकिन हमें उसे महान बनाना पड़ेगा, ठीक है? Then when we look at the professional profiles, I am very sad to report that I comprise of 2 plus 4. I comprise of 2 plus 4, 6%. My profession comprises of 6%. I overlap as a teacher, as a lawyer, so 6%. But 39, what is very interesting to notice, 39% of our MPs have listed their job as political or social service. अब ये क्या होता है मुझे नहीं पता. 38 of them are engaged in agricultural activities, and despite that, we've had not a single discussion by a parliamentary committee on agricultural bills. Only 4% are lawyers, and several MPs have, of course, declared more than one occupation. A few years ago, the Supreme Court had said that MPs can also practice law as long as you are not a minister, because being an MP and just an MP is not a full-time job. ये lawyers की lobby की वजह से हुआ था, ठीक है? Just ये एग्जाम में कभी नहीं आएगा, but this is just fun information to know. All right. इसके बाद ये राज्यसभा का रिव्यू है. Now I don't think this is going to be asked a lot in detail, but मैंने आपको बना के दे दिया है. These are the basics of why the Rajya Sabha exists. Again, deliberation, accountability and legislation. Just wanted to run you through the basic provisions. ये बहुत आसानी से लिखा है. Which is basically the second house of the parliament, traces its origin to the 1919 Government of India Act or the Monte-Chelmsford reforms. This is the second chamber. It never resolves. It's a revisionary house and of course offers a degree of continuity. ये basic provisions कर चुके हैं. And it also helps you balance the separation of powers. The elections were recently conducted last year and last year and after last year. And majority, of course, is an issue in Rajya Sabha because you don't have the concept of a majority, which means technically a bill introduced in the Rajya Sabha can remain pending forever because the Rajya Sabha never dissolves, right? The parties are very smart. They will take up all the controversial bills and they will introduce it through the Rajya Sabha because then it continues to be pending forever. Okay. Now, apart from this, of course, this has been an issue of debate, and those are your basic composition functions. ये हम कर चुके हैं cover. I just wanted to put it down in the main slide so that you know exactly क्या लिखना है. राज्यसभा पे अगर आपको ऐसे आता है, फेडरलिज्म पे ऐसे आता है, तो आप ये सारी चीज़ें लिख सकते हैं कि the Rajya Sabha had came into being on April 3rd, 1952, and that is why, and it held its first session on May 13th of the same year. The Constituent Assembly, which was formed in 1947, had become the provisional parliament till about 1952. After the adoption of the Constitution, we sort of covered this before, but before its existence, there was a central legislature which was under the Government of India Act 1919. The Council of States had about 60 members. The Assembly had about 145. ये सब data है. The Council of Ministers were extremely restrictive in terms of their voting patterns. There was a very selective composition of merchants, of wealthy landowners, and so on and so forth. Women were never allowed to be a part of the Council of States, and the government had therefore. The Government of India Act 1935 had definitely proposed an elaborate and an improved version of the second chamber, but this never ever materialized. Okay, so I hope you understand this. I hope this is clear, and I hope we are able to get this part right. Okay, now. There are some Constituent Assembly debates. There were people in favor, there were people in against. ये 2 साल पहले ही पूछा है एग्जाम में, अब immediately 2022 में तो नहीं आएगा. Some said that we should definitely have a voice to the states because it will help check legislation and federal balance. Some said that होना नहीं चाहिए because it will unnecessarily be a second house and it will not really help in a cognitive and a substantive development of the debate. Elections of the Rajya Sabha become very interesting. ये मैं आपको सिखा देता हूँ. ये हमने उस टाइम पे नहीं किया था. In terms of the technical details, we know this is basic. But let's understand how do the elections actually happen. ठीक है. इसमें भी थोड़ी सी maths है, but this is very simple. See, I hope you know the election procedure, the qualifications of elections. ये हमने पढ़ा हुआ है. You have to be 30 years of age. You're elected by the legislative assemblies of their respective states or territories. Only if territories have a legislative assembly with a single transferable vote. ये सब ठीक है. अब ये करते कैसे हैं, बस ध्यान से देख लो. ठीक है. ये एग्जाम में नहीं आएगा, बट बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग है, इसलिए मैं थोड़ा बता रहा हूँ. ठीक है. See, a candidate fielded by political parties has to be proposed by at least 10 members of the assembly or 10% of the party strength in the house. Simple example. Suppose Rajya Sabha में there are X number of seats, and out of these X number of seats, let us say there are 10 seats which have to be filled through UP. And out of these 10 seats, 2 seats have become vacant. Now, the UP Legislative Assembly will conduct an election and send 2 people from UP as UP representatives of Rajya Sabha at the Rajya Sabha. This does not mean that the Rajya Sabha MPs from UP will have to be from the existing MLAs. No, here the MLAs are the electorate. You can choose anyone. Can an MLA contest for a Rajya Sabha election? Yes. If they win, then they'll have to resign between the two. But you can choose anybody who fits the condition of 30 years and legitimate vote. So it is incorrect to say that MLAs, that Rajya Sabha MPs are chosen from the MLAs. No, they're chosen by the MLAs and only elected MLAs, as we would know because of rule number 1, democratic mandate. Now suppose, let us say, a person A wants to contest a Rajya Sabha election. For that, either 10 members, 10 MLAs of any party or 10% of the party strength, whichever is less, will have to propose their name. Could be from any party, right? If you're an independent candidate wanting to contest a Rajya Sabha election, if you don't have any political party, then you'll have to ask 10 MLAs to give you some form of support. Now, how does the vote work? Voting is by a single transferable vote, which means it works on a majority principle, and election is held on the principle of proportional representation, which means more population, more vote value. Now, a single transferable vote, as I said, means electors can vote for any number of candidates in order of their preference, how this happens with respect to the president as well. And a candidate requires a specified number of first preference votes to win. Each first choice vote has a value of 100 in the first round. Basically क्या होता है? Suppose UP has to choose, UP state legislative assemblies has to choose one person from here, from UP, to represent UP to the Rajya Sabha. And let us say there are 4 people contesting, A, B, C, D. अब president में क्या होता था? You required more than 50% of the votes. Here, there will be a specific number of votes that you will require. A minimum number of votes. And this number of votes will be dependent on population and other factors. ठीक है? Clear? पहली बात ये. दूसरा, each MLA will give a first preference, second preference, third preference and fourth preference. First preference में whatever your vote is, उसको आप 100 से multiply कर दो. अब मैं दिखाता हूँ कैसे. So to qualify, a candidate needs, to qualify, a candidate needs 1 point more than the quotient obtained by dividing the total value of the number of seats for which the elections are taking place plus 1. So I'll give you a simple formula. The formula is number of MLAs into 100 upon vacancies plus 1 plus 1. देखो ये ऐसे लिखते हैं. Number of MLAs into 100. Remember how I was telling you here? There is a multiplication of 100. Each value has a value of 100, right? Upon vacancies plus 1. ये आप करके देखना. Plus 1. ठीक है. Number of vacancies plus 1 plus 1. अब example देखो. Suppose there are 4 seats and 180 MLAs voting. ठीक है. The 4 seats there are 180 MLAs voting. So how many votes will be required? 4 seats, 180 MLAs voting. So 1800 upon 4 plus 1, 5 plus 1. यही नंबर हुआ 1800 upon 5 plus 1. ठीक है? Are we clear on this? Do we understand this? Yes? This is how you get your numbers. ठीक है? Understood this? Yes? तो आपको 36 वोट या 3600 वोट लगेंगे. अगर ये थोड़ी कैलकुलेशन नहीं समझ में आए तो मैं करके दिखा देता हूँ यार. दिस इज एक्चुअली 361 विच मीन्स, और हर वोट वैल्यू 100 है. दिस इज बेसिकली 3600. सो मोर देन आपको 36 वोट चाहिए. सो यू नीड 36 वोट्स हियर. सपोज लेट अस से देयर वर say 200 MLAs and there were 2 seats. So 200 into 100 plus 3 plus 1, that is 2 plus 1, 3. So this is 2000 upon 3 plus 1. अगर ऐसा होता तो you would require 667, 668, 7 votes to win. Okay? We don't say Parliament, we say Lok Sabha only. So this is your election process. Now, ये मैंने आपको बताया था limited form of openness, that you have to show your vote to the party agent, otherwise nobody else can know. And there is no nota in Rajya Sabha elections. This has been struck down by the Supreme Court, right? Power equations between Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, we've covered this before. कि money bills or finance bills can only be introduced in the Lok Sabha. These are finance bills, not financial bills. Budget is a form of a money bill, and it's only the Lok Sabha which can approve for demand of grants. Special powers मैं already बता चुका हूँ, and of course there is a political code that you can use in your essays. अब ये detailed powers मैं already करा चुका हूँ आपको. एक जगह मैंने लिख के दे दिया है ताकि आपको explanations मिल सके. Legislative powers, very clear that they have equal powers and they will have equal voting issues, right? No problem at all. Finances में Rajya Sabha is a weaker house. Executive में you have some powers, but the Lok Sabha still has a higher setup. Rajya Sabha also has certain electoral powers. They also have certain judicial powers, such as impeaching the CAG, the president, the vice president, and so on and so forth. ये सारा का सारा चीज़ें हम कर चुके हैं. Yes, DP. Yes, very good. ठीक है. Then certain exclusive powers, subject of a state as a state list, or मतलब you can basically empower the parliament to make a law on something in the state list. हमने majorities में करा था. Second, it also makes sure that you can do this by 2/3 majority, and then the parliament can make a law on something which is in the state list, and then this is only valid for a period of 1 year, and such resolutions can repeatedly be passed by the Rajya Sabha. Now, all India services का मैं आपको बता चुका हूँ, to increase or to abolish an all India service, and then of course You have certain miscellaneous powers such as emergencies, approval of ordinances has to be done by both the houses, jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and the High Courts, and of course making any change in the membership provisions of the Lok Sabha as well as the Rajya Sabha. Your qualifications of membership provisions. बस इतना ही है. Then of course थोड़ा सा ज्ञान for role of Rajya Sabha. It's a safety valve of Indian polity. It checks and balances. It also represents constitutional checks and balances to the point that it makes sure that before a case reaches the court, the Rajya Sabha is doing enough work on it. It reviews and reevaluates the kind of work that has been done. And of course, even when there is the excessively high majority in the Lok Sabha, it is usually the Rajya Sabha that can therefore have a good check on the balances. ठीक है. Apart from this, of course, it's a deliberative body. It gives representation to vulnerable sections. It also has some special provisions जो हम कर चुके हैं. Then थोड़ा सा ज्ञान जो आप एग्जाम में लिख सकते हो, that there are functions, there is the reason why it exists, and no doubt political party dynamics does affect the working of the Rajya Sabha, but in the democracy and in a functioning democracy, it's passion that often defeats rationality. Therefore, sometimes people will do the right thing and go beyond the politics to fight for what is right. And second, it also is important as a talent retention chamber. I mean, Jaitley Saab, Manmohan Singh Saab, Jaishankar, they may not have the charisma to win local elections, but or Lok Sabha elections, but they are very much needed in as ministers in the country. So it made sense, right? It also gives you entry to experts and stuff like that, and also it creates a sense of continuity because the Lok Sabha can literally be dissolved at any point of time. One day no confidence passes, the Lok Sabha ends. And this is it. And of course, there are certain issues. The issues are states don't get represented equally like they do in the US, which is a basic problem. So in the US, every state gets the same number of seats, 2 seats to the Council of States. In India, that is not the case. It's dependent on the population. 2, the ordinary bills are often certified as a money bill, and like in the Aadhaar case, you then bypass the Rajya Sabha. And third, while you're supposed to represent federal interests, but remember I told you because of Manmohan Singh's election, they had removed the word domicile from the Representation of People's Act, so anybody can contest any places Rajya Sabha seats. And of course, your nominated members are really not participating. And I don't want to offend the god of cricket, but Sachin Tendulkar was appointed in 2012, and the House has met 370 days between 2012 to 2018, and Sachin Tendulkar only attended for 24 days. Then of course there are bills which I've already explained to you, which you can go through it. And then what can be done is, first of course you can have a direct election to the Rajya Sabha. Second is you can give equal number of seats to each state. And third is there needs to be a better procedure for nomination of MPs to the Rajya Sabha, to make sure that the quality of the discussion is good. And of course, you're able to have some form of a committee which screens the people that you're choosing. These nominations should also not be political in nature. And finally, just as a conclusion, good or bad, Rajya Sabha has always been there as a melting pot of diversity in the country. It should not be looked at from a disruptive point of view, but also to be looked at from an enabling point of view. And it makes us understand that a study makes us tell us it's not as powerful as the American Senate, and it's not as useless as the House of Lords in the UK, but it's somewhere between the two. It is certainly less powerful than the Lok Sabha, but it is not a very weak or an insignificant house. For example, with land acquisition and GST, Rajya Sabha really put up a good fight, which is why the government had to make a more inclusive GST policy and the laws that could come within it. And therefore, let's not worry about whether we need the house or not. We need it. The question is, how do we make it better, which is where I've given you recommendations from NRCs and from your ARCs and NCRWC. Okay? All right? Okay. Drop me a message, please. Yeah. Vikram. ठीक है? अब आपकी दया से, आपके प्यार से पार्लियामेंट ख़त्म हो गया, स्टेट लेजिस्लेचर्स ख़त्म हो गए, ठीक है। अब मुझे एक बात बताओ, इसके बाहर कुछ आएगा एग्ज़ाम में? जेन्युइनली बताओ, इसके बाहर कुछ आएगा एग्ज़ाम में? हमने सारा प्रोसीजर, सारा एनालिसिस, सब कुछ कवर कर लिया, इसके बाहर कुछ आएगा? Yes. Tashi just dropped me a message. Vikram just dropped me a message. Any questions? Anything at all? करेक्ट। और आप देखो, इट्स ऑल डन इन अ वेरी सिस्टमैटिक मैनर। आर्ग्यूमेंट्स फॉर अगेंस्ट डेटा, कंटेम्प्रेरी एग्जाम्पल्स, ऐसे, ठीक है। वरुण अभी कॉल करता हूँ मैं आपको, ठीक है। ओके, सेम ही है। विल डू यूनियन टेरिटरी सेंटर स्टेट में अलग से। जयप्रकाश झा, तुम अलग ही सीएजी बने घूमते हो। That is okay, that is his discretion. हाँ भाई, हो गया पूरा पार्लियामेंट थीम 5 खत्म। ज़रूरत नहीं है, थीम 5 ख़त्म हो गया। अब 7, 8, 9 ही बचे सेंटर। उसमें मैंने सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स वगैरह भी करा दिया है। अब सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स के लिए हम एक उसको हम सेंटर स्टेट के साथ मर्ज करके थोड़ा करेंगे ठीक से। बट हाँ, मोस्टली जो है हमारा थीम 5 ख़त्म हो गया है, क्लास 5 थीम 5। अब मेरे को लगेंगे 5-6 डेज मैक्सिमम, मतलब हो जाएगा। बाई 10th of February विल बी एबल टू फिनिश द मॉर्निंग बैच एंड विदाउट रशिंग इट एट ऑल। ठीक है, ओके ओके।